Now, of course, none of this can happen without a development finance institution that really understands and works on a regular basis with both the private sector, as well as the governments, as well as institutional investors, really having its ear to the ground in terms of what type of instruments, what type of policies need to be put in place to actually advance some of these transactions. So I'm glad that we have a great and long-standing partnership with the African Development Bank and the personal leadership of Pierre, who I'm going to ask to speak now, in terms of, Pierre, we'd really just like you to share your views on this agenda so that people can really get a sense of the importance from an African Development Bank standpoint, but also to the overall opportunity that this represents, taking account of the sort of the global agenda that came out of the G20. But then when you drill down, you've got the Africa Compact, you've got the Agenda 2063, and the high fives. And I just want to put my hands up now. There's no conspiracy with fives. I think we've got 5% in 5 years, and we've got the high fives. But I'm sure Pierre will expand on that for us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That's all now. Good. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I'm here mostly to listen to the institutional investors we want to attract to Africa. So I'll try to be brief in my framing remarks. So basically, the African Development Bank is Africa's development bank, is an implementing and financing agency. So what we're interested in, what will it take for institutional investors, whether they're overseas or African, to increase their exposure to African opportunities, in particular longer-term infrastructure projects, but not limited to that. And in that context, what is it that we, African Development Bank, but also other development partners like IFC, for example, can and should do to help create the right environment and making these opportunities more attractive and more suitable to the specific needs of these institutional investors. So, African Development Bank, we have many strengths. One of them is to operate both on the public and private sector side. So we advise governments, we lend to governments, but we also invest in and lend to private companies. We have a big private equity portfolio. We lend to companies directly, as well, of course, as lending to governments. So we can help both on working with governments in establishing the enabling environment that will make it more attractive for institutional investors to come in, again, whether they are overseas or regional investors. And we can accompany these investors through our financial products, risk mitigation products, and others. But so for us to increase this very thin stream of current investment, whether they're the local, again, or the international institutional investors, we need to know what do you need from us to make this more investable. So the type of activities that we would typically get involved in this space, and we work, of course, on many other development agendas, is helping establish local capital markets, which in the infrastructure space is clearly important. We help with local currency bond markets. There are also only about a handful of countries in Africa today that have these bonds, and we provide both advisory services. We have the African Financial Markets Initiative, that is developing also, trying to help develop yield curves for African bonds, and where we have the AFMI, Bloomberg African Bond Index, again, to develop this asset class more generally. So there's a whole agenda of our work that focuses on developing local capital markets, which is probably not the main focus of today's discussion, but yet it's a very important one, in particular also for this long-term finance agenda. As I mentioned, we also provide kind of guarantee instruments, including we've provided a partial credit guarantee for Cameroon's 750 million euro bond issue, which got the African Banker Debt Deal of the Year last year. So we have these instruments. We also help the Tanzania Mortgage Refinance Company, again, by using our own AAA rating to give them the regulatory clearance to have a bond issuance in Tanzania. So there are lots of things we can do. And those examples are very specific ones, how we help specific financial institutions access these markets. What we really want to listen to and hear from you is what is it that you would want from us and other development partners, because we're not the only ones in this space, to make it easier, more attractive for you. What are maybe some of the lower hanging fruit? Let's not get the most difficult deals first, and how could we work together on this agenda. And in that context, I mean, I mentioned already the fact that we invest in about 40 PE, private equity funds. The private equity model is not ideally suited for long-term infrastructure. So what do you see as opportunities to build on it or expand on it and kind of generate longer-term financing? Finally, we have, and you may have heard President Adesina mention it on a number of occasions, we are launching the Africa Investment Forum, and Patrick McGee, who sits behind me there, is our point man for that. So if you're interested in the Africa Investment Forum to go live in November 2018, what we want is not just have one more event, because there are lots of events in Africa and elsewhere in the world, but is to have a real platform where we can help investors and investment opportunities come together by providing a framework and also by using our abilities and kind of leveraging capacity with governments who are not only our clients but also our shareholders. So we want to use this Africa Investment Forum as a really powerful platform to bring investors and investment opportunities together, including by removing whatever bottlenecks may exist for those things to flow and for those flows to increase. So I'm really keen to hear what our colleagues have to say on this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierre. Clearly extremely busy and happy to see that you're prepared to continually open your mind to new opportunities and new ways of doing things, because the market is moving extremely fast with the intervention and intermediation of technology. So I'm now going to call, thank you very much. So we're just going to bring this to a close now with the final remarks from Pierre. And I think, Pierre, the objective was to get the views of the asset owners and institutional investors and those influencing that community to see how it can influence your work in a positive way. So I wonder if you could just give us your reflections and next steps and sort of closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for a very rich panel here. So a few points, and I won't try to summarize everything, but definitely an interesting start of conversation with some of you or continuation with others. And remember, Patrick McGee sits there, so please make sure to get in touch with him afterwards to continue the conversation. But first, one important thing is we need to work with the African institutional investors, and we have Fonses here, but we already work with PIC and others. And I think one of you mentioned that it's important for a signal to come from Africa, that Africa itself is investing in Africa. So for us, that's going to be an important stream. Two, a number of you have invested in infrastructure and other assets in Africa, have attracted or have, as institutional investors, are already present in Africa. It's AMC, clearly, it's the Washington State Pension Fund and others. So how do we work with you to expand on what you've already done? It's kind of how do we expand that envelope? How do we go one step deeper? And then a third point that came across to me across a number of the conversation is that to access a large number of these institutional investors, they are consultants, gatekeepers, whatever you want to call them. So engaging with them and eventually also with trustees, etc., to kind of familiarize them with the African opportunities and get them to understand better what these opportunities are, and getting them to open up their risk appetite a bit and is something critical. Also, in the same vein, clearly many institutional investors are based on benchmarks. We need to expand these benchmarks and getting other African countries in the core benchmarks. And I've mentioned the AFME Bloomberg Global African Bond Index that we're developing. That's just one such instrument, but I think expanding the African exposure of benchmarks is going to be extremely important. And finally, for some of those things, and unfortunately we didn't have ministers here today, for some of these things we'll need to work with governments, with central bank governors and financial sector regulators also to make these opportunities more attractive. But so, in summary, thank you all very much. For me, it's the beginning of a conversation, and I hope we can continue it and certainly meet again at the latest at our Africa Investment Forum in November of next year with some increased deal flow to speak about. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This roundtable is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.